Welcome, everyone, to the latest episode of Scrubbing the Skies, the webinar series of the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal. As always, I'm your host, Will Burns, and I'm co-director of the Institute. And I'd like to welcome all of you for joining us. We have a large audience today. I anticipate we'll have lots of good questions. So, if you've been to any carbon removal powwow this summer, obviously one of the existential questions remains how to scale carbon removal and how to scale it fairly quickly. And with the demise of Running Tide recently, that issue has become more top and center for many. One of the ways that this potentially could happen is to incorporate carbon removal into compliance markets. And obviously, the largest of these potential compliance markets is the Paris Agreement. And within the Paris Agreements, one of the potential places that carbon removal could play a substantial role is under the Article 6 so-called market-based mechanisms. But any of you that have followed the negotiations to determine the rules of the road for operationalization, especially of Article 6.4, know that this has been a bumpy road in general, and specifically in the context of the potential role of carbon removal therein. And so I thought it would be good for us to talk about what the state of play is in terms of those negotiations and where we may be heading in the future in this context. And so I'm really pleased to have an excellent guest to help us do that. Somebody that has been working in the trenches of these negotiations, as he'll outline, and will continue to be involved. So our guest today is Danny Cullenword. He serves as a senior fellow for the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy at the University of Pennsylvania, and he is also a senior fellow at our institute. And as is usually true with our webinars, Danny will begin with an initial intervention to talk about the major issues associated with Article 6, as well as the role of carbon removal within Article 6. We'll then move to a couple of brief questions by myself, and then we will move to audience questions. So I encourage you to begin to populate the question and answer box as Danny's presentation ensues. And with that, I'll turn it over to Danny Cullenword.
Thanks very much, Will. It's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts with you all. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a presentation to outline some issues related to the Article 6 process, and then we will get into a conversation following that. So let me get started. All right, so I want to talk about this Article 6 process and what it implies for the future of carbon removal. Let me start with a couple of very important disclaimers. I want to make clear that my remarks today are in my personal capacity as a researcher. I also want to be very clear that I'm not representing the Article 6.4 mechanism supervisory body, nor its methodological panel. I'm a member of the methodological expert panel, which, as I'll get into, has been tasked with helping to draft some of the documents that will be involved in the operationalization of this carbon market under the Paris Agreement. And I also want to disclose that I've previously consulted for a carbon dioxide removal credit registry, Isometric. Those are important disclaimers because I don't want to mislead anybody about where I'm coming from. And I also want to be very clear, I'm just speaking in my personal capacity today. So I have three goals that I want to work through in this presentation. First is to describe the overall implementation process for the Article 6.4 mechanism. The second is to introduce key institutional context for how the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change operates and how the UNFCCC approach to carbon markets historically informs some of the current activities today. And then the last thing I'll end with is clarify how members of the public can participate in this process and stay better informed. I have to say, I've done a lot of work in carbon markets over the years. This is one of the more administratively complex processes I've been involved in. And I'm appreciative that folks are interested in this topic. I want to try and demystify the process and the context a little bit. so that it's easier for people to follow along from outside of this process. So let me begin with a little bit of context on the Paris Agreement. I think most people know this is the main agreement signed in 2015 under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's the current main agreement framework under which the global community is trying to reduce emissions and stay in line with temperature targets. Our topic today is on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which focuses on voluntary cooperation. And there's three main areas of voluntary cooperation in Article 6. We'll focus primarily on one of them, but I want to name all three because they relate to one another. Article 6.2 has to do with essentially government-to-government interactions that create what are called internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. So you could imagine a country like a Switzerland or a Singapore that wants to invest in an outcome in another country and help claim some of the emission reductions they might contribute to in another country toward their own climate target. And through government-to-government negotiations, that can be done through Article 6.2. There's a set of rules and a process associated with that. The main topic we'll talk about today is Article 6.4, which contemplates a carbon crediting mechanism that looks like a lot like a carbon market, and as we'll talk about, builds on successor approaches to an earlier UNFCCC market called the Clean Development Mechanism. And finally, although I won't say very much about this today, Article 6.8 contemplates non-market approaches to voluntary cooperation. I think that's an important area to be thinking about in the future. We're mostly going to talk about 6.4. And before I get too deep into the weeds on 6.4, I need to go deep in the weeds on an important concept called corresponding adjustments, just to set the stage for people. There have been a lot of concerns around the potential for double counting of climate benefits under the Paris Agreement and in carbon markets, including in voluntary carbon markets. There's a really well articulated piece from 2019 in Science, led by Lambert Schneider and colleagues, that talks about this problem in general in the context of the Paris Agreement process. If you have a project that is located in one host country, but the climate benefits are bought by a buyer country that's a separate country, the question is who should get credit for that outcome? And you might very well end up with double counting if the buyer country takes credit and the host country doesn't take any additional action, because the benefits will show up in the host country's inventory. They might also be separately claimed by the buyer country. And so, to make a long story short, a process called corresponding adjustments was developed that requires the host country to deepen or strengthen its climate target whenever one of these kinds of transactions occurs. And that means that they cause new additional climate benefits when those benefits are sold or transferred to somebody else. And it avoids this double counting problem if it's done well. I also want to call out there's some important technical details that suggest those calculations may not deliver the environmental integrity people want from this program. And there's another great paper that I've cited to here that discusses that. The reason I wanted to introduce this is because corresponding adjustments are mandatory for Article 6.2 transactions. So when two governments get together and want to make an internationally transferred mitigation outcome under Article 6.2, the host country has to perform a corresponding adjustment. There is a parallel requirement for some of the activities under Article 6.4 when Article 6.4 carbon credits are authorized for use in compliance mechanisms. And that means when a buyer might want to use this to count towards their official climate target under the Paris Agreement, a so-called nationally determined contribution, or NDC. It also applies to the International Aviation Offsetting Program known as CORSIA. When the carbon credit is going to be used for an authorized use, a corresponding adjustment is required, but it's optional for voluntary carbon market transactions. And there's been lots of controversy and discussion around this, but I just wanted to call that out as we dive deep into the carbon crediting world. This backdrop of corresponding adjustments is an important technical item to be aware of. All right, let me give you a timeline of some of the major regulatory decisions to set the stage for where we are today. And this process begins with the signing of the 2015 Paris Agreement at COP21 in Paris. It takes several years at the international negotiating level to get additional direction from these annual negotiations. And there's two primary documents, one from 2021 from the Glasgow meeting that's called the Rules, Modalities, and Procedures document that identifies specific requirements for this Article 6.4 market. There's follow-up guidance and input from 2022 at the next year's meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh. In 2023, The Article 6.4 supervisory body, which is I'll share about in just a minute, is the main political body that's organizing and addressing these market design issues at a level that's below the annual meeting of all the countries that get together. Lots of work happened in 2023. I'll talk about some of that. Notably, no decision was taken last year in Dubai at COP28. So the process is operating without the benefit of additional direction from the parties at the last COP. And in the beginning of this year, the methodological expert panel, which is the body on which I'm serving, was appointed. And this panel is supporting the supervisory body in the development of documentation and implementation of these market design mechanisms, ultimately with an eye towards this presumably being revisited at a future COP for additional direction. So the critical concepts to understand both about the Article 6 process and about the predecessor UN market, the Clean Development Mechanism, that these are fundamentally bottom-up market structures. And there's a number of different kinds of documents and governance documents that are going to occur in this market, and were present in the Clean Development Mechanism program as well. I'll start with standards. Standards are one of the more important types of documents. These are documents that describe requirements that apply to methodology developers. There are also tools, which are technical components that are referenced by standards and sometimes by methodologies. And the methodologies themselves are the rules that individual projects must follow to earn carbon credits. And to sort of tie this together, I have an example of a renewable energy methodology. That methodology must be developed according to the mechanism-wide standards on additionality and baseline scenarios. The methodology is going to require certain things of the projects, including that they use specific tools to establish their additionality and to calculate their avoided grid emissions in the baseline scenario. And the key construct here is that these sort of top-down standards facilitate bottom-up market development. In the Clean Development Mechanism, and potentially in the Article 6.4 process as well, individual methodology proponents might come forward and say, here, I have a methodology that I think meets all of the program's rules. Please consider it for adoption. If it's adopted by the supervisory body, that methodology could be used to earn carbon credits. We're in the early stage of the process. We're describing the requirements, especially through these standards and tools, and potentially directly through some methodologies. That's the current work of the process. And if it proceeds according to the model followed by the Clean Development Mechanism, that will presumably end up in a situation where people can submit their concepts for what will work under this market. But again, we're in the very early stages of this process. Wanted to quickly give an outline of the governance structure of the Article 6.4 mechanism. It's very important to understand that everything occurs under the Conference of the Parties, serving as the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement. That's a bit of a mouthful. The abbreviation that's used for that is CMA. So the CMA decisions are the ones taken typically at the annual meetings, at the annual COP meetings. Underneath the CMA sits a smaller body. It's not every party to the Paris Agreement, but a subset of parties that have nominated representatives to the Article 6.4 mechanism supervisory body. And this is the governance body for this mechanism. And there are a couple of different technical panels that report to the supervisory body, including the methodological expert panel. Throughout all of this, you also have the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change Secretariat, which is based in Bonn, Germany, and they provide support services and organize meetings and generally support the processes at all levels here. So again, this governance structure is important to sort of understand what's going on. The decisions of the CMA guide everything, and there's lots of work to implement those decisions that occurs at more granular levels of governance and at finer levels of process detail. I mentioned in 2023 that there were some significant work products advanced by the supervisory body. I've listed 4 of them here. These requirements involve guidance on how methodologies should be developed, what elements they need to require. The second bullet point addresses some issues specific to what are called removals, and that's the term, removals is the term in the UN process that is typically used to refer to what people in the carbon removal industry call carbon dioxide removal. When you see the word removal, think CDR in industry terms, and some additional detail here. The key issue I want to flag here is that these are documents from the supervisory body. They've not yet benefited from instruction from the CMA levels. They're the current decisions from the supervisory body under which the methodological expert panel and others are doing their work. There are, broadly speaking, three priority work areas for 2024. And I want to say I'm doing my best here to summarize without editorializing. We'll refer people to the primary source documents I've linked in these slides for specifics about the details as to what is going on. These are the three categories that the official agenda documents have listed, and I've done my best to cover most of the territory that they include. Again, I'm not editorializing as to what's most important here. The three requirements are priority work areas are: one is requirements for methodologies. So these sort of meta standards around what has to be done in any approved methodology to meet the requirements of the Article 6.4 mechanism. There's a second priority work area on removals specifically. Much of this has been consolidated into a single standard that's in development on the topic of non-permanence. And there's also a third priority work area related to revising clean development mechanism methodologies, these methodologies from the predecessor UN carbon market that I'll talk more about. So all three of these have been identified as priority work areas for 2024, and there's quite a bit here, to say the least. Let me now turn to my second topic and wrap up in the next few minutes so that we can have a robust conversation. I want to give some perspective on critical institutional context for how the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change operates in the context of carbon credits and carbon markets. My perception is that a lot of people operating in the newer segments of today's voluntary carbon markets, and particularly those involving carbon dioxide removal, may be less familiar with these operations. And I think it's extremely important that people become more familiar as we go. So broadly speaking, I like to think of the world of carbon markets as encompassing basically three different eras. I don't mean this to be exclusive, but just to sort of give a foundational point of entry. The first major carbon market program was the Clean Development Mechanism. Both after the Clean Development Mechanism and in parallel to it, we've had the voluntary carbon markets. And more recently, we've begun to see some early stage activity in voluntary carbon markets, specifically for carbon dioxide removal. And I want to flag these three different eras or points of entry into the carbon markets conversation, because each lens that somebody might bring to this conversation typically involves slightly different standards, slightly different terminology, slightly different ways of organizing information. And I think particularly for those coming in more recently in the field of carbon dioxide removal, some of the institutional history and processes of the earlier ones, especially the Clean Development Mechanism, are important to better understand and may be less familiar to folks in this process. And the general hypothesis I want to offer about this field as somebody who's been working in various parts of it for a couple of decades now is that the old hands know a lot about the Clean Development Mechanism. It's kind of the blueprint for everything that came after it. But my impression has been that a lot of people in the carbon removal industry are a little bit less familiar with this mechanism. Many people know they're actively working in the voluntary carbon markets. They get that. That's kind of, I think, obvious to a lot of people. But because the Clean Development Mechanism isn't directly relevant to a lot of the institutional precedents and technical issues involved in carbon dioxide removal, it's not as high of a priority, and understandably so. I think that's an omission that's going to be really important in this context of the Article 6 process, where it's really important. So let me give some quick background on the Clean Development Mechanism itself. This was an international carbon offsetting program developed under the 1997 Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol had mandatory emission reductions for high-income countries. It did not require any specific action from low-income countries, but those low-income countries were allowed to participate in a voluntary offsetting program called the Clean Development Mechanism. They could host projects and other activities to earn carbon credits that could be bought by buyer countries as well as in the voluntary market. The primary instrument traded in these markets was what's called a certified emission reduction, or a CER, each one worth a ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, just like standard voluntary carbon market credits. Major buyers include Japan. Europe, for a time, was the largest buyer. Its emissions trading program, the EU-wide program for the power and industrial sectors, was the largest buyer, up until concerns around credit quality caused the European market regulators to exit this program entirely and prohibit the use of international carbon credits for compliance in that program, which is the situation that persists today. We also have plenty of transactions in private markets as private buyers outside of either the Kyoto or any subsequent treaty context purchase these credits for their own private use. I will summarize the academic literature here by saying most studies have found that most of the credits were not additional. Several of the major studies that have gone in depth on this found widespread credit quality problems. And I think it's fair to say that that perspective informed the European decision to move away from this market, although others in both compliance markets and voluntary markets certainly take a different perspective on that issue. The clean development mechanism had a governance structure that is basically identical to the one that's been developed for the Article 6.4 mechanism process. So I've listed a simplified version of the Article 6.4 process on the left, and you see on the right the very similar process for the clean development mechanism, where you had this governance body called the CDM Executive Board that formally made the decisions. And they had a variety of technical panels, including a methodological expert panel that provide input and support drafting documents, reviewing technical matters, and so on and so forth. It's a very similar governance structure between the two programs and instruments. A few more things about the clean development mechanism that are going to be particularly relevant to the Article 6 conversation. Most CDM projects earned these traditional CER credits. Think when renewable energy, industrial gas destruction, landfill gas, cook stoves. The CDM also had the issuance of what are called temporary or long-term certified emission reductions, so slightly different carbon credits for land sector projects. And the general requirements for these temporary and long-term CER credits was to have ongoing monitoring activities and eventual replacement of the credit. So the general approach was to say things that create temporary benefits only are temporary, and they eventually have to be replaced if they're to be used in a compliance context where they substitute for the effectively permanent consequences of CO2 pollution. To make a very long story short, there was very little activity in these sectors of the CDM market. My understanding is it's fair to characterize that as due to limited demand that may reflect both the fact that there's ongoing monitoring and replacement obligations, which are liabilities and obligations not faced by other categories of projects that earn traditional certified emission reductions. It might also reflect the fact that over the history of the program, the cost of these conventional certified emission reductions was so low that it's probably not worth taking on an additional effort for these temporary projects. Whatever the set of reasons, the outcome was that very little activity occurred in these sectors. In part because of this limited activity, there's some important connections with the voluntary carbon market. I think, again, older scholars in this field are aware of the fact that many voluntary carbon market actors directly imported methodologies developed in the clean development mechanism, and to this day issue carbon credits in the voluntary market using the CDM methods and tools. So a huge part of what we think of as the voluntary carbon market is imported directly from the clean development mechanism. Several of the sectors that are very active in the voluntary carbon market are totally distinct, in part because the clean development mechanism didn't have a lot of infrastructure or methodologies in those areas. And I would call out tropical forest RED projects and temperate forest IFM projects as two categories that, in my opinion, were largely developed sort of outside of the CDM because there was limited infrastructure in the CDM. When people wanted to create these market segments, they had to more or less begin in a separate direction. There's plenty of controversy in the voluntary carbon markets today. I don't need to get into it. The main point I want to make here is you see in the voluntary markets a lot of the institutional and specific methodological features of the clean development mechanism. You also see some segments of the voluntary market that evolved more or less on their own and separate from the CDM, and particularly in the land sector. A few brief words about carbon dioxide removal. I think most people in the industry are targeting voluntary carbon market sales. They usually market their credits as better versions of carbon offsets in some way. I also think it's fair to say in the CDR community that there's lots of conversation about the complexity and intricacies and all of the interesting challenges across methods and pathways. Different pathways in carbon removal have radically different requirements for measurement, reporting, and verification. They can achieve very different durability outcomes. I love this figure from Robert Hoagland, which shows on the vertical axis different durability outcomes you might expect across different carbon removal pathways, and you can stack them from short term to long term. But the reversal risks potentially look very different across some of these mechanisms. And what's so striking is for some of the pathways, you almost guarantee that CO2 will be re-emitted. For others, there's a risk of reversal. You could characterize them anywhere from low to high. And the point is it's quite complicated here when you're thinking very carefully about these issues. There's no sort of monolithic one-size-fits-all approach that I think resonates with everybody in this sector. And there's been lots of interesting conversation about the complexity of these approaches. And this is just on durability. We could have a similar conversation on MRV or other issues. Point is, there's a lot of complexity. There's a lot of heterogeneity in the sector. The other main piece of context that's important for those interested in these issues to be aware of is that there's also a process for transitioning certain clean development mechanism projects from the clean development mechanism carbon crediting program into the Article 6.4 mechanism. And according to the UN's data, something in the neighborhood of 1,500 projects out of about 3,500 eligible projects have applied for this transition process. To make a very long story short, the latest date at which they can earn carbon credits under their existing CDM methodologies is the end of 2025. And any future credit issuance would have to be done under an approved Article 6.4 mechanism methodology. So if you think about this, when I referenced earlier the 3 priority work areas, there are 2 of them that are necessary to accomplish this outcome. You need to finalize the methodological requirements for the Article 6.4 mechanism. You also need to revise the CDM methodology so that there's an approved Article 6.4 methodology for the projects in question. But you could do both of those things, and whether or not you make progress on carbon removals is irrelevant to this particular aspect of one of the articulated goals for this process. So I just wanted to call this out because it's an important and I think politically meaningful area of work that necessarily moves forward 2 of the 3 objectives that have been stated in the program to date. So the last thing I want to do after giving this context and then looking forward to your questions and our discussion is to clarify how members of the public can participate. This is a pretty intricate process. It is, like I say, something as somebody who's been working in these areas for a long time, one of the more complex processes I've ever encountered. So I hope this presentation demystifies a little bit about what's going on institutionally. Let me close with a couple of quick thoughts about this. The first thing is, do not be overwhelmed by the complexity of this process. At a very high level, the decisions taken at these annual COP conferences by the CMA, the parties to the Paris Agreement, that's the ultimate sort of most binding and clear legal direction in the program. It's also important to be aware of the decisions and documents taken by the supervisory body, the subgroup that governs this process. Those are decisions that are made subject to direction from the CMA, and they also presumably will inform future CMA deliberations as work occurs in between the annual COP meetings. The sort of lowest level of the governance process, the methodological expert panel on which I serve, has been charged with drafting various documents. Our job is to support the direction of the supervisory body consistent with the CMA level decisions. So you can look at all this complexity and just remember there is a clear sort of governance hierarchy. The COP meetings, the CMA decisions are at the top, the supervisory body makes decisions, and the methodological expert panel is supporting all of those decisions. On the other hand, there's quite a bit of complexity, so don't ignore the complexity. Some questions that I'll just ask here for the benefit of thinking through this is, in the absence of new CMA direction, we didn't get direction at last year's annual COP meeting. Are the supervisory body decisions subject to potential change, or are they locked in? Another question is, how will differences between carbon removal pathways along issues like durability or MRV and between carbon removal and traditional emission reduction projects, how do those differences potentially affect the development of mechanism-wide standards for methodologies? It's quite complicated to get into a lot of this, particularly if you're taking very seriously some of the challenges that are specific to non-permanence. And then finally, how will stakeholder interests concerning the transition of CDM projects affect the overall priorities and pacing of the development of the mechanism? There's lots of things that need to get done and only so many hours in the day. Some suggestions for members of the public who are interested in these processes: there are opportunities to comment. The supervisory body has 2 more meetings scheduled this year. The methodological expert panel has 1 more meeting scheduled this year. When the methodological expert panel proceeds to a point in its discussions where the panel decides a draft document is ready for public input, that input will be taken at the end, or an opportunity for comment will be created at the end of the public meeting. And at this second meeting of the methodological expert panel, which occurred just a couple of weeks ago, a draft standard for additionality was released for public discussion and comment. Very last thing to say is that the Article 6.4 mechanism is just heavily influenced by the clean development mechanism, both in terms of institutional precedent and often a lot of the individuals and personalities involved in this process. I want to be very clear in emphasizing that a number of the market mechanism activities involve working with existing documents. That's probably easier in some respects to deal with than methodologies for carbon dioxide removal, where there is no existing CDM precedent. It's a blessing and a curse, but I just want to call out this really significant legal difference. And I think it's important to focus on different views about managing non-permanence, which could affect the overall pace of the development of the methodologies and could affect pathways that very credibly offer long-duration carbon storage, where the management of their permanence or non-permanence risks is not generally seen as a major commercial threat. But the fact that these issues are so complicated and sort of bring in all the different approaches are likely to affect the prioritization going forward. And I will stop there. Will, looking forward to your questions and to the audience conversation.
All right. Thanks so much, Danny. And yes, I encourage members of the audience to start populating the Q&A box so we can continue the discussion. But I will seed it with a couple of initial questions. So one of the things that you mentioned is the dirty little secret or not so dirty little secret, right? Is that most of the CDM projects probably were not additional, right? Michael Ware at Stanford and others, right, have talked a lot about this. I'm wondering, within your process, either at the methodologies level or at the supervisory body level, two things. One, is there a clear acknowledgement among these folks that additionality was a real bugaboo inside of the CDM, and what measures, if any, are being taken to avoid that from happening when it comes to operationalizing 6.4?
So that, I mean, to me is almost sort of the elephant in the room. One thing I will say about this process is that not a lot of the process occurs in open public sessions. So most of what goes on is in closed non-public sessions. And I am not allowed to comment on non-public matters. I haven't seen very much in the way of acknowledgement in the public sessions that it's not just a few academic studies. It's like every study that's looked at the CDM market has found not small, but massive problems. And I think one of the things I'll reflect on, I think one of the best ways to answer your question is the methodological expert panel put out a draft standard for additionality that includes, in some cases, as is common in the UN parlance, where you have bracketed options, so different ways you might approach or answer a particular question. And there's a range of options that are presented on some issues. A lot of them look very similar to the approach taken in the clean development mechanism. And the guidance from the supervisory body largely involves replicating some of those issues. Now, there are also other matters that could potentially mitigate some of these issues. In particular, the supervisory body has directed the methodological expert panel to incorporate what's called downward adjustment into the baseline. So in many project areas, you could say, hey, I build a renewable energy power plant because otherwise it's going to be this coal-heavy grid. In theory, countries that have made pledges under the Paris Agreement are also pledging to reduce their grid factors right over time. And so if you were to take into account some of those changes, potentially you could mitigate some risk of over-accrediting. But I think it's fair to describe the mechanisms of the governance structure as largely recreating the foundational elements of the clean development mechanisms program design. And if you have concerns around, how that operates, I encourage you to pay very close attention to what's coming out of this process, because my personal view is if you repeat an experiment for which you have a lot of evidence, you can predict what you're likely to get.
Yeah.
I should also very briefly, Will, one technical detail, maybe I didn't do a good job clarifying. One of the interesting things about the Article 6 process, the clean development mechanism was limited in its eligibility to so-called non-Annex 1 countries. Think what we thought of as low-income countries in the 90s. The Paris Agreement crediting mechanism will be open universally to all countries that participate in the Paris Agreement. So if you have concerns about the additionality of certain kinds of technology investments in lower income countries, some of those concerns might be even more pronounced in higher income countries. So you better hope that the baseline adjustments or other factors are going to help contain those new non-additionality risks. Because you can imagine the economics of financing a wind or a solar plant in a place like, I'll just say the United States, probably don't need carbon credits for that, right? But in theory, you could ask for carbon credits if a methodology is approved consistent with all of the guidance that comes out of this process.
Yeah, I think that's a good additional point. Okay, one other question. It may be one you can answer, one you can't answer. As we looked at the supervisory body's take on carbon removal, right? Initial take was to simplify it, nature-based solutions, good, industrial CDR, bad. Uh, I was wondering if you think there's been a clear, palpable sort of evolution of the thinking, both in terms of the supervisory body and maybe what guidance they've sent to the methodology body in terms of formulating these standards.
So you're referring to, if I'm understanding you correctly, a couple of years ago, there was a proposal. I can't remember if it was from the supervisory body or the secretariat, but it talked about issues like ton year. And I think it was widely perceived as promoting nature-based land sector strategies and being skeptical and sort of even hostile to several long duration carbon removal pathways. And it's hard for me to comment in too much detail. One thing I will say is that the guidance from the supervisory body on the development of methodologies for removals, which was published in 2023, so just a couple of months ago, that guidance document has quite a bit of elaboration that I would describe as taking a very different approach from the one you're referencing. However, how that gets operationalized and what happens in the absence of clear direction from the CMA, from that top level annual conference of the parties meeting, that's all kind of TBD. So, I think the procedural answer to your question is that the methodological expert panel has indicated it's working on this non-permanent standard, which is responding to the later direction from the supervisory body, the one that comes after the controversial guidance you were referring to. And you will want to watch what comes out of that process to ask and answer that question. In the interim, looking at that 2023 guidance document from the supervisory body, I think you'll see a very different tone in that than the process you were describing, but the results are technically in a process that is still to be determined. And I apologize, I'm trying to answer as accurately and completely as I can, but in this respect, the answer is it depends what happens. There is certainly a document that provides different input than the one you're providing. We will see what happens.
All right. Okay, let's move to audience questions. The first is from Clara Kellner. What is the status on the development of a carbon removal methodology? How long will it take to finalize the methodology?
That's a great question. And I think part of the answer is stepping back. We're not at that stage right now. So the standards for the market have to be developed. In theory, they're going to apply to all kinds of activities, emission reductions and removals. But all of those standards have to be developed before a methodology could be proposed that says we're consistent with all of those standards. So we're currently in the process of trying to articulate those standards. And then what's called the methodology proponent would have to come forward and say, here's my methodology. It complies with all of these standards and requirements, and then go through an approval process there. I don't know how to characterize that timeline because the sort of ground documents are not yet written. And that's a process that would occur after the ground documents are written. So we're some time out from that is the short answer.
Do you think it's possible, given the fact that you indicate that there's been a lot of reliance on CDM documentation, that there might ultimately be some path dependence where that really slows down development of CDR guidance because it's easy to lean on CDM guidance?
I think that's a very fair question to ask. One of the things I've been struck by in this process is just like even the language of the technical documents. And Will, if I'm remembering correctly, you trained in international law, so you're presumably familiar with like the text of these documents. These are very dense documents. All of the legal text was created in a time when we weren't thinking about removals. So
Mm-hmm.
literally the verb tense and the descriptors are often not directly aligned. And so I think there is absolutely some significant chance that the sort of institutional precedent and momentum here is going to lead to some gaps that need to be filled in and addressed carefully. If you look at the draft additionality standard, you may see some of that text where, if you were just a carbon removal person, you might have phrased it a slightly different way.
Mhm.
I don't think the additionality standard is the one where I'd be most concerned about that, but there are certainly other pieces of institutional infrastructure written before carbon removal, even if the concepts are fully aligned and there's no debate around the concepts, actually drafting it to make sure that it's consistent with what you would need to show for carbon removal. It's definitely a gap. And one of the things I've been struck by is how the expertise bases of people who are familiar with CDM, there's not a ton of overlap between people with deep expertise in the CDM and people with expertise in the carbon removal world. And I'm encouraged. This has been actually a really thoughtful process. It's been great to meet people from around the world working on these issues, but those are two communities that are going to need to learn to speak a little bit more fluently across one another.
Okay. All right. Next question from anonymous attendee. What are your thoughts about carbon capture and storage, and if there's any potential collaboration in this with the CDM process?
So my understanding is that a lot of the way this is going to be dealt with, if you look at the guidance from the supervisory body, is that a lot of this is going to be thinking about managing non-permanence. And there's some pretty clear language from my perspective in the supervisory body documents about what's required to do that. And I think for subsurface CO2 storage, for example, I think there are stories you can tell about achieving very low risk of reversal, what it would look like. What do you have to do to get to the point where you can declare this particular site now has that attribute? The supervisory body guidance documents talk about basically monitoring your carbon storage until such time as you can show a negligible risk of reversal. So I think it's one of the activities that's being actively contemplated. I don't know how much more I can say at this point because we're sort of at this very high principles level discussion. It's not like these are conversations where people are getting in a room and saying, is this project type in or out? It's about how do you address concepts like additionality, baselines, leakage, non-permanence, reversals. And at that level of discussion, I think it's important to be aware of the different features. And as I alluded to in my talk, I think carbon removal in particular has a lot of heterogeneity across some of these features. But it's not like people are sitting in a room and saying, this one's in, this one's out. We're trying to come up with standardized approaches for how you address those concepts. And that will certainly have implications for individual pathways. But again, I just wanted to communicate. Nobody's sitting in there saying this one's in, this one's out.
Yeah, I think that answers a question they had for in terms of methodologies and looking at permanence and durability. So I'll move to another question, an anonymous attendee. In terms of methodology development in the marine space, what are perceptions on modeling being primary means of verification? That is, marine systems struggle with MRV because of the ocean's physical and chemical properties. It's tough to measure the ocean and not really economically feasible to constantly sample. So a modeling approach seems the only feasible way forward. But do policymakers and buyers and markets agree? It may be above where you are in the process, but has there been, I guess, maybe if I were to distill that, has there been yet at that granular level a discussion of some of the specific challenges of MCDR in the context of CDR under
Um,
6.4?
I'm not aware of anything that's occurred in the public space on that. My impression is that the marine carbon removal conversation is so much farther ahead of where this process is. This is a process that's thinking about what are the requirements first for methodologies to comply. And exactly as the questioner suggests, for some of the marine approaches, you might have to think about modeling-based approaches. The whole point is that the requirements of a carbon crediting mechanism are going to be set through this process, and they're going to have implications for the eligibility of activities and specific methodologies people might want to propose as saying those are consistent with the standards and documents that come out of this process. So I'm not trying to not answer the question. I'm trying to say that the process is not answering that question right now. And for people who are in this community and thinking about what is the future engagement with Article 6, I think the most important message is this very high level conversation is happening. It is not necessarily tuned into the intricacies of some of the more complex CDR pathways. And in many respects, I think the challenges of integrating, let's just say, conventional forestry activities and like underground CO2 storage, those are two massive challenges before you even get into questions like enhanced weathering, direct ocean capture, all the complexities that we in the CDR community like to talk about. Those are several steps removed from the technical conversation that's occurring right now. If it goes extremely well and is very broad-minded and is shaped with all of the input that's required to anticipate those issues, that might not be a problem. On the other hand, if it gets, written by without a clear understanding of those implications, it could have consequences for the pathways that are more, let's call them technically esoteric, that involve specialized knowledge to address and answer some of the common principle-like questions, like how do you think about baselines and additionality and so forth.
Given how difficult some of those issues would be, is it possible that ultimately the supervisory body will decide that uh, we're going to provide an initial list of processes that are eligible under 6.4, and that will expand in the future, which might keep carbon removal on the outside for a while? Or are they going to try to create a fairly comprehensive list at the outset that includes carbon removal? I mean, what do you think?
I think anything is possible. It's not for me to comment on what the supervisory body might decide. But if sort of finishing everything all at once is too difficult, and I think that's a very large task, you could imagine that there would be prioritization. As I suggested in my presentation, if you wanted to prioritize the transition to the CDM projects, that would imply a secondary or later role for carbon removal. You
Mhm.
could also imagine within carbon removal, trying to address some of these issues in some of the, let's call them larger sectors, and leaving some of the more technical sectors for subsequent development. So it's possible you could see staging that reflects the sort of technical readiness and overall interest levels at different levels. Again, I can only speculate about these matters. It takes an enormous amount of work to write down what do you have to do any of this stuff right. And the main message I want to bring to the carbon removal community is the fun conversation we have about look how different our approaches are and how interesting it is to talk about this heterogeneity and complexity. That's got to boil down and be understood by essentially the CDM world. And there's a
Mhm.
pretty big disconnect even for the CDR pathways where within those communities, people feel they've kind of got their hands around the shape of the problem. There's still a big disconnect between that and where the CDM is right now. And there's arguably a bigger disconnect with some of the more technically complex CDR approaches, where it's harder to summarize and say, well, here's exactly how you would do modeling. We all agree how to do that. There's no controversy around that.
Okay. All right. Next question from an anonymous attendee. Will reversals be addressed for both emissions reductions and removals?
That's a great question. One of the agenda items that's been officially announced from the methodological expert panel is a guidance note addressing that exact topic. Um, I personally don't know how to distinguish reversal risk for, let's take a forestry project, an afforestation or reforestation project, versus an IFM project or a RED project. It's not clear to me that there is a technical difference between the reversal risk of those projects. All other things being equal, it's forest carbon. The forest is exposed to risks. Um, but that is a decision process that could come up later. And I think one of the interesting things that I've noticed, because the CDM largely didn't address the land sector issues writ large could be commingled with removals. They could be somewhat separated. We don't really know. My personal view is that land carbon sector issues involve non-permanence risks. And so if you have a comprehensive approach to non-permanence, it would be useful, in my personal view, to apply it comprehensively to all types. But those are political decisions that will eventually need to get made. And it's not clear to me what the implications of either lumping them together or separating them are. If you lump them together, you have to resolve your durability and non-permanence management issues across highly heterogeneous sectors. If you separate them, you might fail to account for some risks, it might also allow you to proceed at different paces with different things. It's very complicated.
Next question from an anonymous attendee. Currently, there are no removal projects in the Article 6.2 pipeline, and under Article 6.4, all the methodologies prioritized for transfer are emissions reduction. There was a proposal on the table at Bonn to transition CDM, afforestation, and reforestation into Article 6.4. Why were they separated out originally, and how confident are you that this will occur?
So the prioritization instructions are given by the supervisory body and potentially by the CMA level discussions down to the level at which the methodological expert panel operates. So it is not for the methodological expert panel to say, here's the item we would prefer to prioritize. So that prioritization discussion occurred at a different level of governance. I don't know if an explanation has ever been given officially. I know if you look at the pipeline of projects that have applied to transition, they are heavily dominated by renewable energy projects and to a smaller extent landfill and maybe also cook stoves. Because there's so little afforestation and reforestation activity, it seems almost axiomatic to me that there would be a relatively small footprint of projects in transition. So if you were trying to prioritize methodological adaptation to support the projects in transition, it naturally follows that the afforestation protocol would not be high on that list. And that's kind of it for removals oriented work, right? Removals have largely happened outside of the context of CDM. So if you want to see removal methodologies, you need to have a finalization of all of these meta standards for the program. And then methodologies need to be proposed that comply with those standards. The transition activities, in some sense, have a procedural leg up. They also require the finalization of all these meta methods, but there are existing methodologies, and adapting them is presumably a simpler exercise than drafting something from scratch. I don't want to prejudice either of those activities, but if you, again, look at the existing methodologies, and we've been told that, for example, adapting the grid-connected renewable energy methodology is one of the priority areas. We can go look at what that looks like, and you can say, what elements of this document has to change to comply with whatever the final standard on additionality is, the final standard on baselines, and so on and so forth. And that's like a review process rather than drafting from scratch. And I think it's fair to characterize that as a simpler task to manage in a process that is heavily represented by people who have long working experience in the CDM.
Okay. All right, next question, anonymous again. Is it possible for the existing voluntary CDR methodologies to be imported into Paris 6.4 once the standards are in place?
My understanding is that the Article 6.4 process is going to parallel the CDM process in being a bottom-up process where methodology proponents can come forward and say, my methodology complies with the applicable standards and seek approval from, in this case, the supervisory body. In the CDM world, you'd apply to the executive board, and there'd be a discussion about that. So yes, in my understanding is that is exactly the architecture that's being anticipated here. And I think one of the challenges to call out is that a lot of both the CDM and the voluntary carbon markets in areas like renewable energy or landfill gas management either use CDM methodologies or are closely related to those methodologies. So conforming them with requirements is arguably a little bit more straightforward than conforming a bespoke methodology developed entirely outside of this context as, with, say, the best of intention and the highest bar possible. That might look a little different from a document and drafting perspective and conformance perspective than a methodology developed through the CDM process that will just tweak a little bit, presumably, to get it done. And again, with both of these activities and both of these types of methodologies, they will have to comply with whatever the final rules are in this process. So again, I'm not trying to suggest that there's a substantive prioritization, but procedurally, because one kind of looks more like the shape of the process we're in, it might be easier to reconcile that than potentially some of the novel CDR methodologies.
All right. Next question from Lily Lee. From the demand side, who might become the major buyers of carbon credits once the standards and methodologies are established?
It's a great question. I think TBD is the best answer I can give you. The Article 6.4 mechanism contemplates both authorized use for compliance purposes. So you could imagine countries being buyers to comply with their NDCs. It also contemplates voluntary carbon market transactions. So I think both of those pathways are potentially open through this process. And if I had to place a bet about the overall Article 6.4 process, is that lots of questions around the sort of credit quality and reputational issues of carbon credits in general will be related to what gets approved in the Article 6.4 process. Or to put another way, if somebody says, I am an approved Article 6.4 methodology, or I have an Article 6.4 carbon credit, they might assert this is higher quality than things that have been controversial in the past. I don't know how to anticipate how that will all play out, but I'm sure those reputational concerns will be part of the overall negotiating process here. I don't know what's going to happen.
Okay. Next question, anonymous. Do you have any brief high-level comments about double counting of carbon reduction removal benefits between national or subnational regulatory and compliance programs or voluntary carbon markets?
I don't know if I have anything short to add on that. I will say that the premise that corresponding adjustments account for this is based on some technical intricacies that I'm not confident in. And earlier in my presentation, I referenced a paper that Lambert Schneider co-authored with another. The lead author was a different person from 2022 in Climate Policy, in the journal Climate Policy, that walks through the math of how this decision was taken. And I think there's some concerns about the environmental integrity of that position. So I don't think corresponding adjustments are a panacea, but that's the tool that was decided for the authorized use of 6.4 credits and all of the Article 6.2 transactions. In the voluntary carbon market, I think there's been a lot of conversation around double counting. And my personal view is there's really only one set of books, and that's the atmosphere. And we're going to have to start to get a little bit more serious about this. I got no problem with contribution claims where somebody says, I am contributing money to a worthy outcome, I'm supporting an outcome, but this doesn't cancel out my emissions. I think for people who want to make traditional offsetting claims, the double counting issues in the voluntary carbon market are going to become more challenging over time, not less challenging.
And is that something that at this early and kind of more 30,000 foot stage that the methodologies committee in, is it a top and center consideration, do you think?
I'm not aware of it being part of any part of the agenda. The way I personally read the fact that you can have Article 6.4 carbon credits without a corresponding adjustment is that the Article 6 process in the Paris Agreement generally assigns those benefits to the host country, right? It's essentially what it's saying. And I think that's led some critics to say, well, no one else should be able to claim credit for that. Others have said, oh, it's kind of two books of accounting. There's a corporate books and then there's the national books. And, the Article 6 process says it's on the national side. But over here on the corporate side, it's different. We could debate that, but my interpretation is that the Article 6 process says the host country is getting that, right? When you have a non-authorized credit, that's what it is. And we could debate what claims are fair or not fair to make in that context, but that is essentially what the emissions accounting says.
Okay. I'm curious, one thing you've adverted to a number of times is kind of the interface between the CMA, the supervisory body methodologies, and exogenous actors. Have you been seeing a lot of kinetics around CDR at the CMA level? And is anything that you've seen that's been feeding into the process that you're involved in?
I can't say I've been watching the CMA level discussions closely enough to answer that with precision. I'll certainly be looking to what happens here. Yeah, I don't know how much I can add on that front other than to say, I think the challenge of addressing non-permanence is really difficult, and it looks different to me across different removal pathways. And I suspect that will be a source of ongoing controversy at all levels of governance.
Okay. All right, we have reached the top of the clock, and first of all, I'd really like to thank Danny Cullenword for this excellent presentation and discussion. I'm sure we'll have you back as this process unfolds. You may have gray hair by the time it's done unfolding, but nonetheless, if you're still game, we will certainly bring you back, because I think it's an important question, including top of mind for us in terms of how to develop responsible carbon removal as we move from voluntary markets to compliance markets. And I'd like to thank all of our attendees also for coming and your thoughtful questions. And stay tuned. We'll have a couple of new webinars coming up, one this month and then a couple next month, and I hope you can join us then. And with that, I'll say goodbye.
Thanks.